everyone. I'm Jiyoon Kim, Executive Director of Asia Society Korea. I am very pleased to welcome all of you and to host today's exclusive conversation on what to expect in the US presidential election this November. Our conversation today will focus on the intersection of US domestic political turmoil and US foreign policy, particularly in Northeast Asia. We have three very distinguished guest speakers today. Dr. Victor Cha, who's a senior advisor and the inaugural holder of the Korea Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. I never had an opportunity to meet him when I was a student at Columbia, so I was really excited when I actually got to meet him after I arrived at Asia Society years ago. I'm really glad that the technology has brought us together in more ways than we could have imagined. And I'm so happy that he agreed to join today's conversation. We have Dr. Robert Kelly joining us, who describes himself in his blog as a BBC dad. He's a professor of international relations in the political science and diplomacy department of Pusan National University. And I just learned that he studies 6 languages, including Latin and classical Greek. We also have Dr. Jiyoon Kim with us, a senior research fellow of the Institute of Democracy and Education, and her research interests include elections and voting behavior, American politics, and political methodology. Today's conversation will be moderated by our senior contributor, Dr. Mason Richey, an associate professor of international politics at Hanguk University of Foreign Studies in Seoul. The discussion will last about 35 minutes, then we will move to Q&A. As many of you know by now, we try to make these sessions as interactive as possible. So may I please ask those of you in the audience to keep your video off and stay muted to not interfere with the speakers. Please submit your questions through the chat box at any time. We will monitor these and call upon you to introduce yourself and ask the question out loud. If you do not wish to ask the question out loud, please say so in the chat box and Mason will read it himself. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion, so we'll now hand over the mic to Dr. Richey. Good morning, Mason.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us here at another Asia Society roundtable. In addition to thanking the audience, I obviously want to thank our 3 guests as well who agreed to join us for this event, and especially to Professor Cha, of course, because he's on the East Coast, which means it's quite late in the evening or early in the night there. So thanks for taking time at the end of your day to join us for this. As Yvonne mentioned, we do want this to be interactive. So not only obviously do we want input from the audience, but I'll also just remind our 3 guests that you're free to ask each other questions and engage in crosstalk. You know, this is supposed to be, at least in part, a sort of a roundtable kind of format. So we don't have to be necessarily chained to the questions that I would like to ask. And of course, as Yvonne also just pointed out, the audience can submit questions through the chat. So we have a lot to get to in a short amount of time. So I'm going to go ahead and get started right away. Just to sort of set the table for us, I think the sort of big lead up front here is that the U.S. is in political crisis. How we got here is a long story that involves economic changes in the U.S., social changes, cultural changes, a loss of violence on the right and on the left. And both Democrats and Republicans hinting that the election will be fraudulent in some way, undercutting, I think, one of the foundational principles of democracies, Republican democracies, which is that the losing side accepts the result is legitimate and peacefully accepts the fight another day. So with that context, I'll sort of start off, I guess, our set of questions with a very brief primer on U.S. elections. The interesting thing about the U.S. presidential election system, or one of the interesting things, is, of course, that unlike most other presidential systems, the U.S. doesn't have a national popular vote. Instead, we have this archaic system that we refer to as the Electoral College, which very briefly entails the fact that that we call elector to the number of members of Congress and the Senate that they have, plus 3 for Washington. My apologies. I didn't know how I didn't mean it there. So one of the interesting effects of the Electoral College is the winner of the presidential election isn't necessarily who gets the largest number of votes nationally. In fact, that was the case for Donald Trump in 2016. It was the case for George W. Bush in 2000. And certainly that, I think, has driven a certain amount of Democratic Party sense of grievance. So, with that kind of context, I guess, which maybe gives us a lead in a little bit to the divisiveness of U.S. politics right now institutionally, I guess I would start by asking then perhaps Dr. Kelly to begin by telling us a little bit more about how the U.S. presidential election system works, and perhaps how the Electoral College produces some interesting effects on the level of the states and in terms of the political behavior of the two parties.
Sure. I think the Electoral College is a pretty huge issue. I think for our purposes, probably the most important thing of sort of two things, I think, is the idea that it empowers the popular vote winner, a popular vote loser can nonetheless be empowered to actually win. And I think that's the most sort of distorting effect, the thing that I find when I teach it in South Korea, that I teach here at South Korean University. The students are sort of routinely baffled by that. I have to spend about a day of class time, about 75 minutes actually walking through the Electoral College. And it's interesting, having done it for 10 years now, that my students often look at me like, wait, what is this? Like, why is this so complicated? How come we don't just tally up all the votes? And that's sort of that, I think, is the first thing, right? Is that it's very complex, and it produces the possibility, which has become more and more real in the last 20 years, of a minority vote winner. And that is I think that's really kind of bizarre, and that has become, as we now have the possibility of a third minority winner coming up this fall, that has become an increasingly large issue. George W. Bush won with the minority vote without winning the popular vote in 2000. Donald Trump did that in 2016. Donald Trump is already planning his strategy around a loss in the popular vote. So if Trump wins again in the fall, that will be the third time in just 20 years that the winner would not have won the popular vote. And that, I don't believe anything like that has ever happened before in the United States. And I think that's driving the sort of radicalism, or sort of like, I don't want to say radicalism, I think it's a bit too strong, but I think that's driving a lot of the anger and the grievance on the left in the United States, as Mason pointed out. And I think if Trump wins this way, particularly if the gap is wide, right? If Trump wins in the Electoral College by just a few votes, but he loses the popular vote by more than 4% or something like that, that kind of a gap that large, I'm actually genuinely concerned that might actually provoke a real outburst on the streets. I think that's the first thing, right? The possibility of, for lack of a better word, minority rule, and that's sort of continuing now. We now are on we're on the cusp of the third time of that happening in 20 years. And the other thing, I think, the other sort of thing that I think foreigners sort of need to know is that the structure of the Electoral College basically pushes the election towards a few places in the United States, that much of the electoral map actually sort of drops out and people don't really pay attention to, because you have a solid state that routinely goes to one side or the other. California is probably the most obvious example here. The Democrats, the left, take California on a regular basis. I don't think a Republican has won California since 1988, right? And so what this means is that neither Democratic nor Republican candidates bother to go to California, because it's just already assumed that Democrats will pick it up. And this pushes the election again and again and again towards a cluster of states, no more than 10 or so, I think, in an election that we refer to as battleground states or swing states. I'm from actually one of those, or what used to be one, Ohio. And today those are places in the Midwest. Florida's also become a swing state. So what happens then is you basically get a clustering around just a few tens of millions of Americans, while the rest of the population kind of drops out. And the issues of the election end up turning on what will win these places. And that, of course, is famously how Donald Trump won in 2016. He won by these very narrow margins in just a few places in the Midwest, and that's what sort of pushed him over the edge. So I find when I teach this stuff, these are the sort of big issues that really kind of bewilder foreigners. One is the possibility that you can win but still lose, and two, the fact that this gigantic election over this very large space of 330 million people actually gets narrowed down to just like 5 or 8 states every year, which feels sort of counterintuitive given the size of the United States. You just sort of ignore places like Texas and California, but the structure of the Electoral College drives it in that direction.
I think it's interesting that you point out the issue of states, because another thing that many people outside of the U.S. probably aren't aware of is the extent to which the states are delegated the authority by the Constitution to run their actual elections.
Yeah.
And that's of course one of the things that we've seen increasingly over the last, I think, 10 years take a larger role, where the secretaries of state of each of the states and the legislative bodies there have set up systems which have worked more or less well or more or less poorly in various states in terms of how votes are counted, the number of polling stations that are open, and the way that the ballots are structured, and things like that. And that opens up, I think, some avenues for mischief making, or at least the possibility that people perceive there being quite a bit of mischief making. And that, I think, is one of the things that we're possibly going to be seeing going on this year with the increase in mail-in ballots and things like that.
Maybe I can add a little bit to Professor Kelly's comment. He's absolutely right. And this year, probably the Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania will be the key states. I mean, it used to be the Ohio or Florida, but it seems that just for Mr. Biden, if he keeps all the states that Hillary Clinton got in 2016, which is probably for sure states, then he needs to get Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And it seems that according to all the projections and the polls, he is very much guaranteed to get the Michigan and the Wisconsin, where in 2016, that Clinton just lost by just 10,000 votes and 22,000 votes. But it seems that it is Pennsylvania. If he gets the clinch the Pennsylvania, it's very much likely for Biden to win. But you never know. I mean, I totally agree with Professor Kelly that if there's another case that happened that we saw in 2016, and there should be a huge demonstration from the liberals that are coming out on the street, because it just doesn't make sense. I mean, Hillary Clinton won actually almost 3 million votes in total, but she lost.
Well, if I could maybe shift over then and ask this question, perhaps go ahead and get Professor Cha involved. What do Koreans and East Asians more generally need to know about what is likely to be different this time about the U.S. presidential election? As I said, I feel like we're kind of on a tipping point, that the U.S. is, standing, on the shores of the Rubicon, and there's a possibility of crossing it or perhaps not. But what would Koreans and perhaps others in East Asia, Japan, China, Taiwan, need to know about what's likely to be different this time about the U.S. election, and how that might affect the relationship of their countries to the U.S.? Professor Cha?
A couple of points. The first is, I think there's a lot of concern in the media about what's going to happen with the election in the United States, mail-in voting, Russian interference, all these sorts of things. But I mean, I still think our system works, and that there has been mail-in balloting for quite some time. Some states are quite good at it. We hear the president saying, mail-in balloting is only good from Republican states and not from Democratic states. That's just all silly talk, So, I still think that our system works, and hopefully it'll work this time. The second is apropos what Dr. Kim said. I was on a panel the other day with some folks who were involved in the campaigns. And again, sort of as both Bob and Jiyoon were saying, this election essentially comes down to 300,000 voters in 8 states, out of a population of 350 million.
Yeah.
it comes down to about 300,000 voters in 8 states. And both parties are going to spend literally billions of dollars to try to sway the votes of those 300,000 people. And they know every single demographic fact about these 300,000 people, where they work, what their level of education is, what car they drive, like everything, right? And so that's, you know, what it's going to come down to, because as Bob said, you know, most of the country has already made up their mind. And you know, we know where California is going to go. We know for the most part where many of the states are going to go, except for these 8 states. In terms of what it means for the rest of the world, you know, I think there are certainly things about Trump's foreign policy and policy in Asia that are unique, but there's also things that I think would continue in a Biden administration. And so just to tick off a couple of these things, you know, the relationship with China now, we in this template of strategic competition, talking about decoupling from China, you know, partly as a result of COVID. And while the same terminology might be used and it might not be as aggressive, I think Biden administration would also take a pretty tough stance when it came to China. I think one of the big differences would be, I would really worry about our alliance system, the US alliance system, in another 4 years of Trump. I think he would work very hard under his America First policy to disengage from most of our security commitments around the world. And I think, you know, Biden, at least as they describe it on their website, would do the opposite. He would work to rebuild our alliances and you know, focus on things like an early meeting of the so-called D10, 10 democracies, things of this nature. You know, I think on the Korea relationship and the Japan relationship, you know, if it were Trump, I think, you know, we'd obviously still see a lot of concerns about cost sharing and the very transactional view of alliances, as he's done with both Korea and Japan. I think in a Biden administration, there'd be much more of a focus on taking a much more holistic view of these alliance relationships, not focusing only on the amount of money that countries spend on the alliance, and also probably a big push to try to improve bilateral relations between Korea and Japan, and then trilateral relations among the US, Japan, and Korea. I mean, we could go on and talk about all these different aspects, but just to start, I'll mention those things. So, thank you.
Great. Professor Kelly, Dr. Kim, do either of you want to say something to any of those things, or any of those thoughts? I mean, I want to come back to a few of those issues, and notably the alliance issue, of course, and the strategic competition issue with China. I'm definitely interested in coming back with that, but if you want to jump in for a couple of thoughts.
If we're going to cycle back to that, oh wait, that was mostly what I was going to say. I think Victor is broadly right, but just, well, in 30 seconds, I mean, like here in Korea, you sort of, Trump talks a lot and there's a lot of media coverage of sort of like Trump's language, but actually like on the ground, I mean, almost nothing has changed. You know, like if you go to like Camp Humphreys, it's gigantic and it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I mean, the actual on the ground footprint of the United States here actually looks quite stable, right? I mean, Trump talks a great, I mean, this is Trump, right? I mean, he talks a great deal and there's a lot of stuff on Twitter, but it's not actually clear how much that actually is filtering down into the bureaucracy, right? Sort of America's institutions and actually leading to real change, certainly out here. And so it's kind of, it's hard to know what Trump is going to do here. Is he really going to retrench? I mean, he talks a big game, but like that hasn't happened really like on the ground. So
well,
maybe the second term will be different. That's what people say, maybe, but I don't know. In the first term, it seems like a lot of hot air and not too much actual action here. But
well, I think there should be some difference in North Korean policy by the U.S. administration. If Biden is elected, there should be very different. I don't really expect a top-down any some kind of thing or event as President Trump did. And also about the relationship between the South Korea and Japan. I mean, we all remember that even though the US cared a lot about the relationship between the two countries, but I don't really remember President Trump engaged a lot when the two countries' relations are really bad. But in the case of Biden, he probably will engage more than President Trump did. One thing I still think is, I mean, although there should be a lot of changes, you have to see how the Korean government is taking it. I mean, it depends on how the South Korean government is react to the new foreign policy. If Biden comes into the White House, you see that how the Korean government is going into which direction regarding the North Korea, regarding Japan, regarding China and the United States. So there might be some differences when the new administration comes in, but I don't know how to take it and how to handle it. It also depends on South Korean government, I think.
Great. Thanks for those thoughts. If I can kind of maybe flip the question around a little bit, we don't only have an audience, of Koreans or those in East Asia. We'll also have an audience, and have an audience in the U.S. And of course, when we put this on YouTube and on the Asia Society Korea website, we hope that people in the U.S. will also pay attention to this. So if I can flip the question around and say, instead of asking what Koreans or East Asians maybe should think about, the U.S. election, what do those in the U.S. need to know about how this likely unusual 2020 U.S. presidential election is perceived overseas, and what that perception might mean for the future ability of the U.S. to influence the world, especially in East Asia, in its favor? Or if I can just put it more simply, what do domestic politics mean for U.S. foreign policy, especially in this region?
Well, I think one of the ways that to answer that question is to say that I think in many ways the world, the international community, global society is very disappointed in the lack of U.S. leadership. The most obvious example of that is the response to the pandemic. I think both Jiyoon and Bob would agree with me when I'd say that in all the academic writing about things like global pandemics, most of the literature agreed that a response to a global pandemic would have to be multilateral and transnational, given the nature of the threat. And that, of course, was not the response to the novel coronavirus. If anything, it was a page out of realism. I mean, entirely beggar thy neighbor, self-help, atomistic behavior. And, if there, I think, and with the two most important players in the international system sort of, snapping at each other's heels about saying whose fault it was. This is not the way the United States should handle crises like this. And even though there's a lot of talk about, particularly outside the United States, decline in U.S. power, when it comes to crises of this nature, I think most countries look to the United States for leadership. They still look to the United States for leadership. They still look to the United States to help to fashion or lead a multi-nation coalition. There are many other countries that are equipped to do that, including countries that have responded well to the pandemic, like South Korea. But the reality is that unless the United States is there to support some sort of broader global response, China is not going to do it. Other countries are not going to do it. And so I think one of the reasons why we've had such a disjointed response where every country has acted on their own is because the United States has been absent as a global leader. And I worry about if a vaccine is found, that instead of there being, global cooperation, public-private partnerships, governments working with, whether it's Gavi or the Gates Foundation or whoever it might be, that it's going to be beggar thy neighbor again, and the United States will be at the front of the queue. I mean, Trump has already said that he only cares about the United States. And that's just, to me, that's just unacceptable. So I think the stakes in this election that Americans need to know about is it's just not about domestic politics. It's about the liberal order.
If I can just follow up briefly, you said that there's disappointment. Do you have the impression that that disappointment, cashes out in some way in other states and their leaderships, looking to make their arrangements with other states more resilient by, pulling away a little bit from the U.S. or hedging in some way in their relationships, or are they sort of condemned to continue to work with the U.S. As best they can under Trump, simply because the dividing line between the U.S. and China and the growing rivalry between the two is so distinct?
No, I think everybody's hedging. I mean, why would they not hedge? Everybody should be hedging. They have they can't rely on the United States. I mean, that's just been the reality over the last 4 years. And so I would expect them to do that. In addition, I think countries have also used the United States to promote their own domestic goals. So, closer to where everybody out there is today. I mean, I think, for example, Prime Minister Abe, developed a very good relationship with Trump and did things that he wanted to do in terms of a domestic agenda, including, a greater military profile, more defense spending, and then thanked Donald Trump for that, right? And in Korea, Moon Jae-in had a very clear agenda with regard to inter-Korean relations, pursued that, and thanked Donald Trump for that. And so I think the countries and allies have sort of also used Trump to pursue their own goals and legitimized it by saying they were doing it for the United States, for the alliance, for domestic to deal with their domestic political opposition. So I think the dynamics are quite complex, but they're so different from what we all as international relations scholars are used to saying and studying. It's been so different, and I'm ready for some normalcy again.
I think many people in the world are. Dr. Kim, Professor Kelly, anything you want to chime in on that?
Well, I agree with Professor Cha, and many people are disappointed with the lack of leadership of the United States, particularly when we are facing the pandemic worldwide. But another thing is that we still do not have a replacement of the United States. I don't know, some people probably have thought about China, but it turns out that China is not really ready for that. And so afterwards, after this election, I mean, who becomes the president probably show the world that we going to the zero world, or at least we can postpone, to some time to go to the Z0 or G0 or the China or whatever. So, and one thing that I would like to emphasize, particularly in Korea, is even though people have different ideas about the president, it can be Obama, it can be Trump, but Korean people still have very favorable feeling toward the United States. So it moves a different way. So president can be popular or unpopular, but the U.S. itself is still a very trusted country to a lot of Korean people. But that kind of difference may actually, disappear if the President Trump keeps going on for another 4 years, and maybe the cutting off the alliance, and just showing, I don't know how he will act if he doesn't have any re-election issue. But so far it's okay. I mean, there's enough of time that we can remedy the image of the United States and the leadership of the United States. Yeah. But for another year, it keeps going like this. I'm not really sure whether or not it will still be there.
Professor Kelly?
Yeah, sure. Just a couple quick points. So in the last 4 years, and sort of my experience of speaking to Americans, more like home over Christmas or something like that, a couple of points that I emphasize. the president has really talked a lot about how he sort of like brought respect to the United States back and stuff like that. That to me is the most glaring distinction between what is actually happening out here in the rest of the world and the rhetoric back in the United States, right? I mean, in the rest of the world under Trump, I mean, the perception is that he's sort of clownish and buffoonish and stuff like that. I mean, Korean news, just, my TV, I mean, they put up Trump's tweets and they translate them, and then the people in the news stations look at each other like, what is he trying to say? And like, why is he saying he loves Kim Jong-un? And like what does that mean? I mean, I go to conferences and people look at me like, well, what does the president mean when he says this on Twitter this morning? I'm like, I really have no idea. I'm surprised how many times I go to events. Actually, maybe I shouldn't be anymore, but I'm surprised how often I go to events in East Asia, especially in Korea, but around the region, where this is what happens. The president says something on Twitter over the weekend and it just hijacks the entire conversation. And we spend, panels talking about trying to sort of divine what the president, and so like for like a nice example of this is when Moon Jae-in and the South Koreans, and to a certain extent, Shinzo Abe talked about giving Donald Trump a Nobel Prize for engaging North Korea. And it was like I was in Korea at the time. It was an open secret in South Korea that this was just Moon Jae-in just flattering Trump. I mean, people were just like laughing about it, right? Of course, he doesn't deserve a Nobel Prize. 6 months ago, he's talking about obliterating North Korea from the earth. Now he's going to get a Nobel Prize, and Trump believed it, right? And Trumpist media just jumped right in. And for weeks, there was this big discussion in the United States in the spring of 2018 about whether or not Donald Trump would win a Nobel Prize. It was just absurd, right? And I think that's sort of the first thing that Americans maybe need to see, right? Is that Trump has really just brought down America's reputation for sort of competence and everything else. And that, of course, has been dramatically reinforced by the way we've blundered on COVID. I think at the beginning, the perception with Trump, at least out here in East Asia, was, okay, it's like, we don't know what the Americans kick up. I remember I went to a conference once in Japan where somebody said to me, Trump is just another loud American. And it's like, another American who sort of talks too much and gesticulates like and we just have to learn to live with these people. This is what the U.S. system kicks up. Now, I think, we're kind of getting to the point where that Jiyoon brought up, which is that if Trump gets reelected, it's going to look like, whoa, this isn't just like some weird one-off thing created by this bizarre American constitutional architecture of electoral college where the loser can still win, right? Like foreigners just don't understand like how we have a system that a winner can still lose. It's bizarre. Anyway, if Trump wins again, then it no longer looks like Trump is some weird one-off bizarre outcome, a kind of cul-de-sac of history while the United States gets back to, normalcy, like Victor was saying, right? If Trump wins, I mean, the GOP, the Republican Party, will become pretty much thoroughly Trumpized, right? Which is to say, in my opinion, it's going to make the Republican Party look a lot like the National Front, to be blunt, the National Front of France. Authoritarian, semi-authoritarian, kind of increasingly openly racist, gangsterish, contemptuous of democratic norms, right? That means that every time Republicans hold the presidency, you're going to get the kind of behavior you've seen in the last few years with Trump. And I'm not sure America's allies fully grasp just how much norm busting Donald Trump has done. I find this when I talk, especially here in Korea. I think, Mason, you and I had a thing once at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I sort of made this pitch about how like Trump is basically kind of like a gangster, I would argue. And I find that Koreans just aren't quite ready to grasp the fact that the United States have elected somebody like this, which in some ways is actually a compliment to us, right? And the Koreans are kind of like, you're not really crazy enough to elect somebody like Donald Trump who like is going to like just ignore Congress completely and kind of rule as like this authoritarian, are you? And the fact is that we did, in fact, right? I mean, if you read sort of left of center journalism in the United States today, places like Vox and Slate, I mean, they're genuinely concerned that Donald Trump is becoming like some kind of proto-Mussolini. And I think that has not really sunk in out here. The extent to which Donald Trump is cutting away at republicanism in the United States and the genuine threat to that he represents if he gets reelected. That's one thing that I think hasn't really happened. And I think in the second term, there's going to be a real sort of sharp awareness of that here when it's like, oh my God, Trump really is going to like force us to pay $5 billion or he's going to pull out USFK.
If I can just jump in real quick. So I'll say this, we're starting to get some questions coming in, so I don't want to hold off on those too long. So I just want to get to one or two more things and then we'll start turning things over to questions from the audience. Professor Kelly, you just kind of hit on something that I definitely, wanted to get to, and I wasn't exactly sure, where to include this in the conversation, but now you've sort of provided me with the bridge to do that. And, I think that, 2020 is a sort of litmus test for U.S. Republican democracy. Professor Cha earlier was a bit more optimistic, I would say, thinking the institutions are still holding. You seem to have a bit more of a pessimistic take that the U.S. may be becoming institutionally unmoored in some way. And I think one of the possible expressions of that is that we're seeing not only analysts and pundits, and let's call them the professional political class, but also researchers who are doing work on the current election, notably the Transition Integrity Project, showing that there's a very good chance that we're not going to end up with a clear winner on election night, and that we're heading for a disputed and contested election result into November and perhaps even December and beyond. What are the risks of this disputed election? A contentious and contested election season was the term that Niels Gilman used, rather than an election night. What are the risks for that, both domestically in the US and also internationally? I mean, presumably this is going to hobble the ability of the US to engage proactively overseas. So if I can get some feedback from each of you on that. Perhaps start with Professor Cha.
Well, it's hard for me to answer that question because I just don't know what, I mean, people can predict that we'll have a contested election, but I just don't know what the outcome is going to be. I mean, we have had contested presidential elections before in the United States. If all the worst predictions come true, this would probably be even more of a controversial election, and the litigation of the election result would be much more controversial in this instance than it has been in the past. But it's just hard. It's really hard to say right now. I think whatever happens, Donald Trump, if he loses, is never going to admit that he loses. I think we all know that. He's never going to admit that he loses, but he's going to have to go. I mean, if he loses, he's going to have to go. So it's really hard for me to sort of say what, will that mean that somehow our democracy is threatened or our institutions are falling apart? I just can't cross that bridge yet.
What about, what about a disputed election and the U.S. foreign policy, notably in the region? I mean, how do you think a disputed election and a particularly contentious lame duck period would affect the ability of the U.S. to engage proactively, notably in this region?
I don't think it would have that much of an impact. I mean, I think most of the countries may just wait till the dust settles and then see what emerges. I mean, there's of course the possibility that there might be some countries that see an opportunity and might overreach or overreact. That's not implausible. But I think for the most part, allies and partners and everybody will wait to see the outcome, and they'll be very pragmatic about it. They'll say, look, we got to work with whoever emerges from this thing, for better or for worse. And I think that that is the attitude that allies and partners have taken as when we've changed governments in the United States, and that'll probably be what they do again.
Great, thanks.
Well, it seems that that's a big reason that whoever it is should win big. It should not be the neck and neck. And there's I think there's a concern because of the vote by mail. A lot of the voters are applying to vote by mail, particularly according to the Huffington Post and NBC poll. I mean, a lot of the Democrats are disproportionately prefer voting by mail, and every state has different deadlines. And some state has a really long deadline, so that's probably one reason why we can expect that result would not come out on the election night. But I agree with Professor Cha. So I mean, the regional security and then other countries would not be very much concerned about that. I'm more concerned about the domestic politics in the United States. There should be a huge polarization if there's a disputed election. But there's one chance that China maybe use it as a big political propaganda. I mean, we all remember when Trump was elected 4 years ago, and China said, "Oh, see, it's a much better system in China. In the democracy, sometimes doing bad, and so that could be used for the political propaganda by China.
Professor Killen?
Sure. Yeah, just a couple of things. So the best possible outcome, the best way to sort of get past the polarization that Jiyoon just mentioned is, of course, a landslide election by one or the other. That would sort of create a definitive victor. That's, I think, the big issue now. And a lot of that sort of concern can be laid at the feet of the president, who has constantly sort of stirred the pot in this question of whether or not he wants to stay beyond 2 terms, whether or not he'll accept the election, damning various things as fraudulent voting by mail, for example. It's the most obvious. Early voting too, right? And we've already had examples of sort of Trump-aligned groups harassing early voters in states. That's already beginning to happen. I think the bigger concern, and I think increasingly the likely one, because the vote will probably be pretty close, is that because so many people due to COVID are going to vote by mail, and many of them are going to be Democrats because the president has encouraged his voters to vote, what you're going to get is the perception on election night of a Trump victory, right? But then as election week goes on and the votes get counted, increasingly Biden will pull ahead, and then the election may change. Now, Trump being who he is, sort of a kind of a cutthroat, amoral striver, if you will, right? My guess is he will declare victory. This is the real concern. This is my concern. This is why I really worry about the scenario. That Trump will declare victory on election night, right? And then he will basically flush out all of the Trump-aligned street groups, QAnon and the bikers for Trump and the militias and the guys driving around with the flags and stuff like that. And they'll be cruising around these sort of like swing states, showing up in front of polling locations and banging on doors and everything, just like happened back in 2000. Trump-aligned media, Sinclair, Fox, and the rest of it, OANN and all these other sort of media organizations, which talk to about 1/3 to 40% of the country, will basically say Trump is won, Trump is won, Trump is won, and that voting by mail, counting the votes by mail is theft. And then you get a real polarization problem, right? Then you've got sort of like Trump groups cruising around swing states or something like that, possibly intimidating voters, possibly intimidating vote counters at the boards of elections and stuff like that. And then you descend into something like Florida, where the whole thing gets kicked into the courts. And this is also where I think you get the fear of political violence, right? Is that, I mean, Trump has been winking at basically militias for a while now. And I genuinely am concerned that these people are going to actually hit the streets on election night and in the days after, right? And that's my biggest fear for how this thing might freeze. And then I don't think anybody really quite knows what happens. It winds up in the courts, I suppose.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have time to discuss the passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and what that might entail for the Supreme Court if this election were eventually to end up there. That's something that I can, I guess, just encourage our audience to go out and read about on their own. So there was one last thing I really wanted to get to, but I think probably the best thing to do is for me to actually fold it into the questions that we're getting from the audience. I wanted to talk a little bit about, go back, I guess, to talk about alliance relations between the U.S. and South Korea and how this election affects the U.S. on the peninsula, how it affects South Korea, and how it affects U.S.-North Korea relations and also North-South relations. I had a few questions in my head for that, but to some degree, we're getting some of that coming in from the audience already. So I'm going to actually just go ahead and perhaps turn it over to the audience. So we've got one question that is the following. Will President Trump try to do something with North Korea before the election? And this was primarily directed to Professor Cha. And then sort of follow on to that, in terms of policy towards North Korea, will President Trump change his policy if he wins? So maybe Professor Cha can chime in on that.
On the first question, so I was actually of the view that there might be some sort of so-called October surprise, where there might be a last-minute deal that Trump would cut just before the election, to, again, just to sort of give him something else to toot his horn about. I don't think that's the case anymore, obviously, because we're so close to October, but largely because he's already got his October surprise, if you will, and that is the deal that he has done in the Middle East. And he's also getting nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for the deals he's done in the Middle East. So that really, in my mind, is, I think about Trump's calculation. So I think he feels he's checked that box, right? So he needed, a foreign policy success. And so he has one, so the North Korea thing can wait. Besides, the North Koreans aren't sending any signals now that they're interested, and why should they? Because they want to wait to see the outcome of the election. If Trump wins, it would not surprise me if he went for an early meeting with Kim and tried to make a deal that probably would not be a very good deal. But then the danger is that he would throw in US troops into that deal because he wants to get out anyway. I mean, we have a data set at CSIS where we've scraped every statement that Trump has made about troops abroad going back 30 years. And it's very clear. He doesn't want them in Germany. He doesn't want them in Korea, maybe in Japan, but certainly not in Korea and in Germany. And, he's going to draw down 7,500 troops in Germany. So that something very dramatic, I think, could happen on the Korean Peninsula if he were fairly soon after he were elected. If it were Biden, I think like I said, I think we'd see more normalcy in terms of the overall alliance relationship, a much more holistic look at the alliances and valuing of the alliances, reaffirming sort of common values, common global agenda. I mean, the sort of thing that many of us as alliance managers are used to hearing about the alliance. And then I think on North Korea, there would still be interest in negotiation, but it would be a much more expert negotiation than sort of this top-down approach. And I don't think Biden would be averse to a summit meeting, but but in traditional fashion, the groundwork would have to be laid for him to step into the room with Kim. That I don't think should be a surprise to anybody. And it's they've pretty much outlined this in their platform, in their foreign policy platform.
If I can, I guess, sort of follow on that, and then we can also get Dr. Kim and Dr. Kelly to jump in on this as well. But I guess speaking of this, the package that might involve Trump throwing troops into a deal where there might be a meeting with Kim, how prepared is South Korea for that eventuality? I mean, have they realized, you think, really substantively that is a potential possibility? The current Moon administration, as we know, does have in various, influential foreign affairs and security policy positions, some people with let's call it checkered background on their support for the U.S.-South Korea alliance. How do you think the Moon administration would take that step of, potentially troops being drawn down?
You're asking me?
To begin with, that's what the question was, but eventually this is for everyone.
So let me just be very quick, because I'm sure that Jiyoon and Bob, being in Seoul, have a much better read on this. My sense is, most of them wouldn't like it. It would be a shock. The U.S. troop commitments to Korea, I think, are still important in many respects to most of the political spectrum in South Korea. It would be even more shocking if it were a bad deal. And I think it would be a bad deal because I don't think Trump really cares about the details of the deal. In fact, if I had one wish in a situation like this, it would be that Trump would actually try a little bit harder to understand the details of the negotiation. If you read Bolton's book, it's very clear that he was just not interested in the detail. So if O'Brien or whoever it was, or Pompeo, or may not be Pompeo in a second term, but if whoever it was could just get on their hands and knees and beg the president just to pay a little bit more attention to the details of this, that would be, I think that would be good. But yeah, I think it would be a shock to most folks, especially if they saw that the deal that was reached didn't really do anything to eliminate the nuclear threat.
Dr.
I
Kelly?
don't know how Jiyoon or Bob feel about that.
Dr. Kelly, Dr. Kim?
Well, I think you can think in the two different ways. I mean, if you think about the government, we also have seen that where this Moon administration is focusing on. I mean, you have seen all the security line was replaced just 2 months or 3 months ago, and then it is very much focused on the North and South relations and to be improved. If that happens, I don't really think that the Moon government would. I cannot find that why the Moon government would be unhappy. So that's. But you also have to think how the Korean people see it. Still, although this government is very progressive and do not particularly maintain that very nice, good, and friendly alliance or relations with the United States, but still, a lot of people in South Korea think the U.S. is a very important partner and the U.S. Army should be stationed in Korea. And also, there's the fear about China by the public. I mean, we all remember what happened in 2017 when the THAAD was deployed and China retaliated Korea for that. And so if you compare how people feel about the US and feel about China, there's a huge difference. So in that case, the public and the government would have a very different idea. And I guess, it's going to be next year, and the Moon administration is going into the almost the final year. I mean, because the presidential election in Korea will start probably the later part of the 2021. So even if that happens, I don't know. It depends on how if Trump is reelected. It depends on him and his decision, but. It's not going to be very easy for the Moon government to accept it and welcome it that much, because he's going probably into the lame duck, and the Korean public still want the U.S. Army in Korean Peninsula.
Professor Kelly?
Yeah, sure. Just a couple of quick points. One, I'm actually a little bit skeptical that Trump would bother to meet Kim again. I mean, Trump, as Victor and everybody else has sort of noted, I mean, Trump doesn't actually really care about these issues terribly much. He got the pictures that he wanted with Kim Jong-un. The point of all that was to give him something to run on in re-election. He may or may not use that in 6 weeks, but once he's back in there, I'm not really sure that he even cares. I mean, we know he doesn't like South Korea. There's a lot on that, right? But I'm not sure he actually cares to fight the bureaucratic battle necessary to pull USFK out of here. It's worth noting that when Jimmy Carter talked about the same thing, 40 years ago, he ran into a wall of bureaucratic resistance in the State Department, and Defense Department, and the foreign policy community. And eventually that effort just sort of petered out. And I think Carter only managed to pull out 3,000 soldiers, and Trump just, to my mind, I mean, we know that Trump spends a lot of time watching TV. We know he spends a lot of time playing on his phone. He doesn't listen to briefers. He doesn't read. If Trump is going to do this, he's going to be pushing the ball uphill, because he's basically going to be alone, because most Americans, at least at the foreign policy level, think this alliance is sort of a good idea. There's broad support out there. There's broad support here. Trump is going to have to basically really get in there and fight for this. And Trump traditionally just hasn't done that. So I'm actually I'm a lot more skeptical of Trump's ability to actually climb that hill. That's why I mentioned in my earlier comments that if you actually look at the on-the-ground structure here in Korea and in Japan, it's actually basically unchanged. Again, it doesn't mean that Trump is somehow powerless, but I mean, there's a hill he has to climb, and I'm not sure he's going to do it. He's going to face resistance in Congress, even from Republicans. Republicans are traditionally hawks, particularly on North Korea. Okay. Also, I would sort of point out that, when it comes to sort of withdrawing troops, if we're going to have a deal with North Korea, and like a real deal, like actually that gets the North Koreans to give up something meaningful, like missiles or warheads, not just like one, but like something substantial, I don't know, inspectors or something, we're going to have to offer the North Koreans something substantial, right? And, and that's one of the things that undercut the American bargaining position in the 3 meetings Trump had with Kim, right? Trump's talking about sort of like modernization vaguely and building condos and stuff like that. None of that's real. Right? If we really want to deal with the North Koreans, these are the kinds of things they're going to ask for. They're going to ask for troops. That doesn't mean we should do it. right? But the North Koreans are going to ask for something, a good deal more than just the Americans throwing around a bunch of money and rolling back sanctions. They're just not going to give up nukes for sanctions. We know that now after 3 years, right? I mean, Moon and Trump have been dangling that in front of the North Koreans for a while, and they just haven't gone for it. You know, the North Korean elite is willing to ride out the sanctions because they off-put the costs of those sanctions onto their own population. The Kim court does not suffer from the sanctions, the population does. So, you know, and to be perfectly honest, I'm not really sure how serious 28,000 soldiers contributes directly to South Korean defense. You could make an argument that that's mostly symbolic, it's mostly a tripwire, and that the real American commitment out here is air and maritime. If you accept that, then maybe you can actually give up a bit of that symbolic stuff in order to get the North Koreans to sign a deal. Now, I actually oppose that myself because I think the North Koreans are going to cheat. I think the symbolic value of having USFK here is high. But if you really want to go for some kind of big bang deal with North Korea, then these are the kinds of things that have to be in play, like big stuff, because we're asking the North Koreans for big stuff. And that's why I would argue that the negotiations the last 3 years have fallen apart, because we asked the North Koreans for a lot and we didn't give them much. Thank you.
This is the thing that I worry about what Bob said, is that so I do think that Trump wants a deal with North Korea. I was speaking to someone the other day at another event, you know, who knows him pretty well, and who doesn't know like the issue well, but knows Trump well. And he basically said that if there was one issue that Trump went all in on, you know, against the best advice of all of his people, it was North Korea. That was like the one issue where he went all in, right? And he wants to finish it. You know, he wants to finish it. Now, how you define finishing it, like the good deal that all of us want, will not necessarily be the deal that he's looking for, right? He's looking for something that allows him to say, I solved this. And it may be more, and it's got to be more than what previous presidents have gotten, but it doesn't have to be a lot more. And then if the North asks for more for that, you know, troops or whatever, you know, I don't think he cares. Like, I think he'll give those up. And again, there'll be a lot of resistance. It'll probably create a constitutional crisis because Congress will pass laws to try to prevent him from doing this, and he'll be the commander in chief, and he'll say that in peacetime I can do whatever I want. Right? This is not wartime. This is peacetime. And there is a predominant view in this administration that they believe those sorts of policies, you know, ending endless wars, bringing troops home, they believe that that truly represents the foreign policy inclinations of the American people, and that people like us are just, you know, East Coast, West Coast, elite establishment. You know, we're not sort of tied into the real America. And, you know, and we could debate that, whether you agree with it or not, they believe that. They really believe that. And or maybe they just say they believe, but that's sort of their argument every time you say this is crazy. You know, NATO actually matters, and Korea and Japan matter. This is the sort of response you get. And that's, you know, that's kind of what worries me about a second term and a bad deal with North Korea.
Great. Okay, so we're definitely bumping up against the end of this, and so I'm gonna close with one last question that came in, which should really only require some fairly short answers from each of you. So the question is to each of you to provide us with one useful fact or one useful insight to keep in mind about how the U.S. presidential election will unfold this year. Like, what is your lodestar for how we should be thinking about the election this year, domestic or international, in terms of impact? Let's start with Dr. Kim.
Well, I'm more actually interested in the domestic politics of the United States. This election will change the political landscape of the United States. The Democrats are different from the Democrats of 20 years ago, and the Republicans are totally dominated by the Trump supporters. And it is actually Trump party. And afterward, it's going to be very different. It's not the Democrats we used to know. It's not the Republicans we used to know. And also and probably the 10 years from now, 10 years later from now, it will be very different America from what we see right now. That's what I can say.
That sounds ominous.
No, I do not really mean
But-
it. It can be good. It can be better.
Professor Cha.
One fact about that
Fact,
people should know.
insight, or yeah.
Well, I guess here in the U.S., prepare to stay up all night on election night, because I don't think I don't think that it'll be something that can be determined right away. And secondly, like I said, that it's only going to be a few people that really determine this, right? It's only going to be about 300,000 people that determine the outcome of this election.
Great. Dr. Kelly.
Yeah, sure. I think it won't be election night. It'll be election week. And I think we need to start thinking about that. COVID is going to drive a huge number of people to vote by mail, and all those votes can't start being tallied until election day. So they're basically sitting in bins somewhere right now all across the country, and they're going to be piled up, and it's going to take forever to go through them. And that's sort of where you have the possibility of Trump declaring victory in order to create sort of perception that he won, and then it sort of unspiraled, that unfolds, that comes apart as Biden starts to win the actual later count, and then you get some weird court fights because Republicans won't admit voting by mail was legitimate. So that's the specific for the election itself and the days around it. I think the larger issue though is and I say this as someone who used to work for the Republican Party in Ohio. I think this is the course of the Republican Party after this election. If Donald Trump wins, this dramatically resets the Republican Party from a center right to a hard right party. And the Republican Party is going to change a lot. And Trump is too dissociated and too disinterested and personally corrupt and lazy and everything else to actually sort of like really run with the changes that he has created in American constitutional democracy. My real concern is a post-Trump Trumpist, someone like Senator Cotton, who said on the New York Times editorial page a couple of months ago, that we should use military force against protesters. If you get a genuinely coherent, intelligent, competent Trumpist in there, as opposed to the current Trumpist, Donald Trump, who's checked out and doesn't go to meetings very often, doesn't listen. That I think is a genuine concern for American democracy in the future, because the Republican Party is drifting towards an anti-democratic course. And that to my mind is the big thing on this ballot. If Trump loses, then there's a chance for the Republican Party to sort of come back towards norms and rules. If Trump wins, I don't know what the Republican Party is going to look like. Certainly not the GOP that I worked for back in Ohio before I moved to Korea.
All right. Well, there we go. Will the U.S. cross the Rubicon or not? An open question.
Yeah,
maybe we can revisit this after the election, and hopefully maybe we can bring you all three on here again and get your post-election insights on where the U.S. will be going forward in the future, both domestically and internationally. Thank you very much for joining.